welcome to Hacks, Workarounds, and Creative Solutions, how unsupported use cases reveal the true needs of your API consumers. So I'm Karen White. I'm a developer advocate at a company called BigCommerce. So we're a SaaS e-commerce platform, and we've got offices around the world, but we are headquartered here in Austin, Texas. So as a developer advocate, I spend a lot of time between our external developer community and our product team, helping us make sure that we're building out our APIs in a way that makes sense for the developers that actually use them. So I do a lot of user research and feedback interviews, and then my job is to take that back to our product team to create some awareness around how these APIs are actually being used in the wild, so to speak. So that helps us to inform the way that we design our APIs, and also helps us decide what we should work on next. So when I'm having those conversations with the developer community, there are times that I come across what you might call a workaround. So a workaround is a solution that technically accomplishes what you're trying to accomplish, but in a less than straightforward way, right? So maybe the data that you need isn't available in the context that you need it, but you found a way to reverse engineer things, or proxy the request to make it work. Or maybe you need to store some extra data on a particular object, and you do that by, repurposing some other field to stuff that data into. So because developers are problem solvers, right? They're going to come up with a way to do what they need to do, whether or not you provide a happy path for them to do it. It might not be the greatest solution. It might not be something that they're super proud of, but it solves the problem in the meantime. So in the spirit of that kind of freewheeling problem solving, I'm going to borrow a metaphor from one of my colleagues, Nathan Booker. So how many Texans do we have in the audience here today? A lot, okay. So in Texas, we have something that we call the Texas exit. Now, if you're not from Texas, you might know this by another name. So the Texas exit is the act of crossing that unpaved grassy area that separates the highway from the frontage road without the use of an exit ramp. Maybe we didn't actually invent this in Texas, but we like to name things after ourselves. So now you might look at somebody who's attempting this maneuver and think, wow, what an impatient jerk. But there's another way that you could look at this, right? So that guy who's tearing across the grass, he had a problem, right? Maybe traffic was moving too slow. Maybe he really wanted to get to that gas station that's on the other side without having to make a U-turn. And you have to admit, he solved his problem, right? So that's one way of looking at it. But for those of us who think about things like user experience, there's another conclusion that you could draw to. So if 10 people a day are performing a Texas exit to get to that gas station, maybe you should just build an exit ramp there. The takeaway is that a workaround is trying to communicate something to you. And the evidence of that workaround, so those tire tracks across the grass, so to speak, that might be your best indication that a better solution is needed. Because the thing is, that guy solved his problem. Maybe he would have liked a better solution, but he is 100 miles down the road at this point. So he's probably not going to stop and tell you, oh, hey, by the way, it would be really cool if somebody would build an exit ramp. So this kind of feedback can be really difficult to capture. And that goes for developers who are using an API as well. So for every one developer who contacts you to let you know that they would like a better solution, there are 10 more who are just going to hop the median, so to speak, and patch something together and move on. The thing about a workaround is that it solves your problem at least temporarily, but it probably causes you headaches down the line. So it's almost always going to be a fragile solution, and that makes it really difficult to adapt or scale if the needs of the project change even slightly. And it also makes it really difficult to onboard new developers onto your project, because now that new developer has to understand kind of all of the ins and outs of this hacky solution. So from the perspective of a product team who's building something that's meant to be consumed by external developers, there are pitfalls too, right? Because you make the assumption that the developer community is only extending the platform in one way, the way that you think that you provided. But just because you didn't create a happy path doesn't mean that developers aren't going to try to forge a solution regardless. It's just going to be more difficult. It might be a solution that they're not totally happy about, and it's not on your radar because you assume that no one is doing it. So an example that illustrates this is the evolution of the BigCommerce checkout page and the APIs that we surface to customize it. So we're a multi-tenant SaaS platform, and that presents some kind of interesting challenges when it comes to providing access points for the developer community to customize. So there's not complete visibility into the updates that we push to our products, or all of the code that powers the core application. So APIs then are really that crucial avenue for developers to be able to customize things on the platform, and because of that, having complete API coverage has been really important for us. So you kind of have this balance between leveraging all of the things that are nice about a SaaS solution, like not having to worry about your own infrastructure, but also being open enough for developers to configure the product in the way that they need to. So the checkout page is a good example of an area that used to be extremely locked down. So in the past, the checkout was a single-page Angular application whose source code was completely hidden, and it also consumed internal APIs that were not documented. So because we made it difficult, people just didn't customize it, right? Wrong. Developers found all kinds of ways to customize it. And it's really a credit to our developer community because through these workarounds, they were able to extract a lot of extra functionality out of the platform, which provided value for our mutual customers. So by watching the network requests in your developer console, you could see the calls that were being made to that internal API. And I feel like the network request tab is kind of like the poster child tool for putting together an alternative solution. But anyway, from there, you could kind of reverse engineer what the checkout page was doing, and then you could build your own features that hooked into that internal API. So why is that not a great solution to the problem? There are kind of two things wrong, in my opinion. So the first is that we should really be providing a better way. You shouldn't have to resort to a workaround to do something that there is a very good business case to do. And then the second issue is that a lot of times the way that we would find out about these kinds of solutions is by breaking them. So if you have an internal API and it's not documented, when the engineering team makes updates to it, they're not thinking about breaking the contract in the same way that you would with a public API. So it goes back to the idea that your engineering team assumes that no external developers are hooking into that functionality. So there's no reason to communicate updates that those are about to happen. And definitely for those external developers, it is a use-at-your-own-risk situation, which they're definitely aware of. But that being said, it's never a great situation when you update something and it breaks a site's checkout page because now that customer is losing money. So that's something that we want to avoid. But the bottom line is that merchants who use the platform want a checkout page with custom functionality, whether that's a particular layout or design, or they want an app that creates something like a buy online, pick up in store step. And our developer ecosystem is going to figure out a way to build that, whether or not we make it easier for them. So let's make it easy for them. Let's build that exit ramp where it's needed. And the way that we approached that was to build a public API for the checkout page that you can call client-side. So the checkout API exposes all of the business logic of the checkout, right? So all of the calculations and functionality that back-end e-commerce platform is providing. Things like based on all of the products that are in the cart, like how much to charge for shipping, how much to charge for tax, of course, taking the payment. And then we released a JavaScript SDK to interact with the storefront checkout API. So for developers, that gives you a nice wrapper with methods that you can call to move the shopper through the checkout process. And what that allows you to do is basically reskin the checkout page. So you can build your own front end for the checkout that is visually exactly what you want, and then you can build in logic to do features like a pickup in store step. And then the third thing that we did was make changes to our native checkout. So under the hood, it matches up with what we're providing to external developers. So now the native checkout is consuming that same public API and checkout SDK, So there's consistency between what we provide to the developer ecosystem and what the native feature is using. And that gives us the happy path for customizing checkout, which is now to use the Checkout SDK and the Storefront Checkout API that underpins it. So no more watching for network requests to try to figure out what the internal API is doing. And what that does is it creates a contract between our development team and the community. Because now we can say we know that you're customizing the checkout page in this particular way, and we promise not to make any breaking changes to the API without telling you that are going to affect your integrations. So that creates stability and trust, and it gives developers a path to creating a solution that actually lets them sleep at night because they're not worried that it's going to suddenly stop working with no warning. So the question then is, how do you be proactive about gathering that kind of feedback from the community about workarounds? Because like I said before, the developer who's put a workaround in place has technically solved their problem. For the most part, they're probably not going to go out of their way to clue you in about this need that's not being met, because they've been able to solve the problem on their own. And yes, sometimes you're going to find out about workarounds because you deploy an update and all of a sudden developers are calling you because their integration has broken. But you want to find out before then. So there are a few communication channels that it helps to pay attention to make sure that you're aware of how developers are actually using your API in the wild. One of those is Stack Overflow, or if you have a proprietary community or Slack, where developers are asking questions. Developers come to these places when they get stuck, so getting into those forums and answering questions is good for a lot of reasons. But one reason that it's good is because you can figure out how developers are actually solving these problems, whether that solution is ideal or whether it's less than ideal. And you also want to develop a good working relationship with the other internal teams who work closely with the developer community. So the team that does API support is going to be on the front lines of getting a lot of that feedback. But I also recommend talking to your sales engineers, talking to solutions architects. Those teams are working closely with developers, helping them hash out solutions, and they probably have a list of go-to workarounds that they've seen and even maybe that they recommend. And then, of course, there's talking with developers themselves. So you want to identify community members who are engaged and who seem to be kind of like pushing the boundaries of your platform. And then you want to schedule time and sit down with them. So you'll get valuable feedback, and it also gives them an opportunity to kind of get an inside look into your company's thought processes about things. So maybe the feedback that comes up, some things are things that are already on your radar, but it gives you an opportunity to kind of like bring them in and help them become part of the solution. So we've been kind of hard on workarounds so far during this talk, but a workaround is it's not necessarily a bad thing, right? If anything, a workaround is a testament to thinking outside of the box when it comes to creating solutions. So we love it when the solution to a problem is really clean and elegant, but in the real world, sometimes the only thing that matters is actually getting the job done. And you might feel this way too. Sometimes I see a workaround that is just kind of clever, right? You have to kind of admire the ingenuity. But that being said, a workaround is not great when it creates tech debt or a solution that's prone to breaking. And it's also not great when you get complacent about the workaround and it becomes kind of like the official go-to solution to the point where you actually kind of stop seeing it as a workaround at all. So sure, you can open a can of tuna by rubbing it on a cinder block, which I guess is success if the goal is just to get the tuna out of the can by any means necessary. But dude, at some point you really gotta buy a can opener. And that kind of leads to how you as a product organization view workarounds when you're doing roadmap planning and kind of thinking about stack rank among the list of all of the things that you want to do. So there's a danger that you get kind of complacent about the workaround. When you're trying to decide where to put your engineering resources and what you should work on next, it's easy to look at something that has a temporary solution in place and say that it's less of a priority because there's some kind of solution that's available, even if it's not the greatest one. But don't forget that a workaround is a Band-Aid. So don't put a real fix on the back burner because the community has found a way to circumvent the issue for the time being. If anything, a workaround should be validation that there is a real demand for the functionality, which is a signal that people actually want to do this thing. But as I've mentioned, workarounds are tricky feedback to capture because a lot of times you just don't hear about them. So when you're having a conversation with a developer, they want to tell you about all of the things that they haven't found a solution for yet, not necessarily the things that they have. So you really have to be direct and actually ask the question, what are the things that you're doing now that you would like to have a cleaner, solution for? What are the workflows that you have in place that could be even more efficient? So it's not enough to just have a solution for a problem. You have to ask, is it a good solution? And could we as a platform make it even better? So in summary, make sure that you're present and listening to spaces like Stack Overflow where developers are having conversations. Set up regular communication channels with internal teams like your API support, solutions engineers, who are on the front lines of helping developers to solve these problems. And talk to developers themselves about how they are actually using your APIs. But once you discover what those workarounds are, the work doesn't stop there. So as a product and engineering organization, you have to look at workarounds the right way. That means recognizing that workarounds are a message from the developer community that your use case is there and the need is not being fully addressed. And then that means making space in your roadmap for enhancements that address the pain points the workarounds create among the developer ecosystem. And you want to create the happy path for developers so they don't have to go off-roading. The exciting thing about APIs, right, is that they expand the circle of use cases that your product can accommodate. But you build those APIs without necessarily knowing what all of those use cases are going to be. By being proactive about going out and talking to your developer community about what they're doing, what they're building, what problems they're running into, you can begin to strengthen your partnership with them and build APIs that truly meet their needs. All right, I'll be back for Q&A.